I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Dustbowl Diatribes. For this month, we have on David McKerracher of Theory Underground. Anything you would like to add to that introduction or make sure people know about you?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me on. It's a great pleasure to meet you and an honor to be here. And this is a nice little follow-up to having met Laurie recently when I had her on at Theory Underground. I've been getting a lot from her book, and I'm really excited to find out more about your project. But as far as my introduction goes, yeah, what more would I say? For now, I'm the thinker of Timenergy, right? Like that's the book that I published most recently. So, I look forward to getting into that a little bit. And I think it kind of relates to a lot of your interests in terms of building culture and, the conditions of possibility for the human existing in the future, but, not just existing, hopefully thriving. And the concept itself comes out of realizations trying to organize, right? And so I hear from what you were saying before we started recording, you're all definitely interested in that kind of stuff, the kinds of crises, I guess, that we inevitably run into when trying to organize some kind of change.
Sure. Well, and I guess before we get into the time energy stuff, like we named this podcast in part, the concept of the diatribe is like, what is your critique of modern society? What's right with the world? What's wrong with the world? In a nutshell, just to help introduce you, what would you say to that?
What's wrong with the world today? I kind of want to start out my diatribe, I suppose, by saying that I've been really working with my students in my two different sociology classes at Boise State University, as well as the students in my courses in my seminar at Theory Underground, especially over the last month and a half, asking them a lot of different questions to try to hone in on not exactly their opinions, their direct opinions, but more like what are their conceptions of the situation, especially when we're talking about three fields in particular. The fields being, I call these the three A's, the crisis of the academy, the crisis of the attention economy, and the crisis of activism. So the three A's. And this research, I'm going to go ahead and just put scare quotes around the word research, and then I'll actually go ahead and say it's anti-research. It's the furthest thing from research. I just don't want the IRB people to sue me. But this research that I'm doing is trying to get at the crises of legitimacy or legitimation when it comes to these very important fields. And so, one of my favorite examples is across my two social classes, which are, these 100 level classes, 80% of my students in each class think that 60 to 80% of their peers are only attending the university for a job coupon or to make friends. Right. Not for a higher calling, not for the idea of university, not to become serious intellectuals, not to become, agents of social change. It's a job coupon and to make friends. I guess with social science or anything remotely close to social science, I tend to kind of be like, okay, well, we already knew that. Like a lot of what social scientists do is they come along and they say, hey, look at this thing. We found out. And it's like, yeah, you're telling us what everybody was already saying. What's the big deal? But I guess as someone more trained in philosophy than in the social sciences, as someone who's more of a social theorist than, say, some statistician, I've just realized that it's one thing to generalize about the situation, and it's another thing to ask other people what they think people think, and then share that out. And so, in my last, I guess in the last month, it's been a really good conversation starter, just sharing the little pie charts that I get from those kinds of questions. But the real crisis for me, is one of scapegoating. And it's not like this typical scapegoating where people are going to talk about the ethnic other, or, I would go further and I would also say that, Democrats scapegoat Republicans and Republicans scapegoat Democrats and both sides scapegoat people who don't vote, et cetera. But I want to focus on the big scapegoat, the biggest of them all, which is the smartphone today. Everybody's like, oh, it's so distracting. It's making me crazy. And it's true. That's true. These things are not wrong, right? The Silicon Valley elite, they don't allow these phones into their schools. They don't let their children on them. So obviously there's something going on here. But also in the 1990s, families were breaking down. In the 1980s, families were breaking down, right? We can go back to Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman and think about what TV was doing, what he was seeing that made him so much more pessimistic than his mentor, Marshall McLuhan, right? Because Marshall McLuhan thought we were moving towards a global village thanks to the television. And Postman's like, actually, it's reduced everything that comes through that tube to pure entertainment, even when it's very, very important stuff. Like the message of that medium is entertainment. But, we can go back much further from there, to the 1800s. Like Kierkegaard is the one who wrote about the public, and he talked about the cycle, the negative sort of downward spinning cybernetic positive feedback loop of ambiguity, non-committal curiosity, and idle chatter, right? And it's like, this was the time of the newspaper. This was not TV. So people have this tendency to blame the medium, which obviously is an accelerator, an intensifier, and every revolution in the medium absolutely changes the game. But the whole time, that whole stretch of time, the global mode of production is job-centric, not calling-centric, not passion-centric, not human-centric or human value-centric. The mode of production is job-centric, right? And I put it that way instead of saying it's capitalism, because socialism in the 20th century, actually existing socialism, was very job-centric as well, very workerist, very seize the earth and let's just grab a hold of it and just draw out from it everything we can take. And of course, there's a lot of necessity that goes into that. There's good people on both sides looking out for their best interests, or at least thinking that they are. And there's an arms race. It's about survival, and if we don't win, then they're going to kill us. And so, of course, war kind of brings that dynamic. But what I care about is not the politics of all of it or the economics of all of it. I care about humans trying to live the good life. And I just want to kind of bracket a lot, very radically, and just hone in on the fact that almost everything people complain about, almost everything that people beat themselves up for not doing, as well as the things that they beat themselves up for doing, though we might blame things like TV, newspapers, or smartphones, TikTok, what have you, at the end of the day, it's all a crisis of time energy. Because if you don't have, and here's the definition of that word, if you don't have large, energy-infused, repeatable blocks of reliable time available between people, then you can't do very much more than passive scrolling. You can't do much more than non-committally curious, ambiguous idle chatter. That's just the facts. You can't build meaningful relationships with your family, with your loved ones, you can't expand that zone of interest to your neighborhood, to your broader community, to the world. It's not very easy unless you have loads of privilege, and you're able to kind of just post up in a university somewhere and kind of bury your head in the sand and say, oh, I love the world and I just want the best things for the world. But in the meantime, the child slavery goes on. The entire country's reduced to coffee beans and sugar and rare earth minerals. Just goes on. And then people do their little privilege walks, and they have their little oppression Olympics, and then they try to recycle, and they try to vote right, or they go to a protest every once in a while. But they keep beating themselves up for the things that they're not doing, or for the things that they end up doing instead. But at the end of the day, those are all just coping mechanisms for the fact that we are broken, that we are structurally stultified of our time energy, which is the absolutely necessary resource in terms of human self-actualization.
Okay. When Tocqueville came to America and interacted with all sorts of people here, but like listened, among other things, to Native Americans in the Western, or, people who had met them. What he heard was that Native Americans often looked down their noses at settlers because of all the farming and all of the work that they did, to have that roof over their heads and to have the few or expanding luxuries that they were seeking, and that it would be better to sort of live a very simple life that they had, where they did take a few risks, but they had a lot of leisure time because it was so much closer to, just subsistence that they were going for in hunter-gatherer type. Now, I'm not suggesting that we do that, but I think, your book, as I understand it, I didn't get all the way through it, but I'm like 2/3 way through it, seems to be saying kind of like the other end of that spectrum, which is that maybe we need to like fully automate since we've gotten this far, so that we can have that same sort of leisure, but also have all the kind of amenities of advanced civilization. So is that the kind of leisure that is that the aim ultimately for you?
Yeah, sort of. I think so. But with some clarification or some stipulations, because I definitely am not on the fully automated gay space communism bandwagon. That's not my cup of tea or my meme. Those people often have never really done any meaningful work. They don't find fulfillment in meaningful labor. And I do. And not only do I don't really matter. I'm a social theorist. What matters here is that large swaths, if not all humans, need meaningful occupations, right? And I say I kind of leave it between large swaths of humanity and all of humanity, because I don't know. I don't want to be too broad here, but it does seem true. A lot of people who hate jobs have only worked these meaningless, alienated jobs. And I guess there's this question I'll set off to the side for now about, like, well, is it pure ideology, this idea of the calling, of the occupation that is not just a career, right? Like, well, let's set that aside. And I'm just going to go for now and assume, yes, there are meaningful and real callings that actually people get turned on to, like they get sparked. A flame comes alive and it gives their life meaning and passion, and it makes them something that they couldn't have been otherwise. And they bring something more to the world and to others, and everyone appreciates it because they're spreading that passion. I think a lot of the careers that are noble in name are noble in name because they're like these primordial occupations or these primordial callings, but they get captured by these institutions. And so Illich would, talk about the difference between convivial and manipulative institutions or tools. And Andre Gores takes that a little bit further in his Farewell to the Working Class, which is a super interesting work. Now, what I really like that he does is he talks about the sphere of necessity, and he talks about like heteronymous labor being this thing that's necessary for dealing with necessary labor. So there's necessary needs, necessary labor, and heteronomy is going to have to deal with that. And then there's the realm of freedom, or you could say autonomy or cooperation. Like autonomy and cooperation are not quite the same thing. Cooperation, you kind of give up autonomy because you're buying into working with other people. And once you are taking on responsibilities with other people, you're sacrificing some degree of autonomy, right? And so he talks about the realm of heteronomy, autonomy, and cooperation. But like in genuine cooperation would only come after you have entered that space of autonomy, so you can make the choice to be cooperatively engaged with these other people.
And
I love this little.
Could you define heteronomy?
Yeah, that's a good one, because that's a weird word, but it's like coercion or like you're kind of forced to do it, is how I think of it. But let me pull up the actual definition. Define heteronomy. But yeah, well, that's not the right word. That's heteronym. Yeah, it's the state of being controlled by an outside force, or the idea that a person's actions are influenced by external factors. And so, if you're in a work camp your entire life, or if you were a slave, then you could say that your entire life is lived within the sphere of heteronomy. Like I'd say most working class people live their entire lives in the sphere of heteronomy, that they think that they get outside of it after work. But of course, because they are exhausted, they have really nothing but garbage time or a kind of energy that can't really be harnessed towards their higher human capacities. And so the realm of heteronomy, for him to even say that is, I mean, it's kind of edgy, the fact that he was saying this to the New Left, which is so, influenced by anarchism, and we can't have any restraints, and we just have to liberate desire. And he's saying, no, guys, like somebody's still going to have to make the ball bearings. Someone's got to do that. And so that, the idea is to limit that as much as possible. And so bringing it back now to Laurie's question, automation, if it can be harnessed, should be harnessed towards the end of restricting the realm of heteronomy as much as possible, which would leave open meaningful callings and fulfilling work that people are going to do no matter what, which would include farming. Yeah.
Gotcha. So can you tell us a little bit about, well, I guess before we get to your book, then how would you lay out, would you identify if you have a problem with historical Marxism at the end of the day? Are you some sort of like a social democrat or
Mm.
I don't know, some sort of council communist.
Yeah,
If
I
it,
definitely get called that sometimes by people. The fact that I have enjoyed some of Paul Maddox's work definitely gets people calling me a council communist, even though I don't subscribe to his politics. I just think he's got some important work. But there's a lot of those sort of left-con people that I can find interesting. I mean, but really, I find them all interesting. I think they're all fascinating historical characters. I'm just not convinced that there is a political solution uh, that has a good enough diagnosis of our current situation, and that real new forms of politics are only going to come from a new approach to the situation, right? But with that said, yeah, what is my relationship to Marx? That's worth dwelling on for a moment. So I'll just say out the door, I'm not a Marxist because I do not believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat. And for people who really like to gatekeep that term and have these long conversations about whether you are or are not a Marxist or you're the right kind of a Marxist, I just like to lead with, well, I just don't want to play this game, and so I'm not one. How about that? Deal with it. Right? It's like I would prefer not to, but I can't think outside of relation to capital. And I've read volume one a couple of times. I've read Mihail Heinrich's introduction to the three volumes a couple of times. I've read a bunch of, other secondary literature. And then I'm always trying to go back to the three volumes. And I'm one of those weirdos who just lives his whole life underneath the shadow of that stack of books and is always like trying to think, okay, so capital, the accumulation of surplus value, the mobilization of labor power by capital. What does that actually do to people, right? And I'm very influenced by young Marx and that part of young Marx that continues in old Marx, which is like that part that cares about alienation, alienated labor. In the Grundrisse, there's a parenthetical where he says the only difference between the worker and the slave is that the worker during the good times in capitalism can at least like attend lectures in the evening and spend time with his children, right? And that statement, it's like, I think the reason he throws it out there as an aside and he never felt the need to write a chapter about it is because it was obvious to everyone. No one felt the need to say it. But 100 years later, Marxism very quickly had just completely lost the plot. I think part of the reason being a sort of a leftoid resentment, right? Like just actually resentment against anybody who's not doing the most mundane or menial forms of labor. Anyone who has anything nice, there's always like that sort of leveling tendency. There's a one approach that says let's lift everyone up, and there's the other approach that says let's tear it all down. And I've never been one of those tear it down people, and I don't hate the bourgeoisie. I don't hate the PMC. I don't. But my biggest hesitation with Marxism when it comes to the dictatorship of the proletariat is that it becomes a thought and movement terminating cliche because it presupposes we know everything that must be done. Now, of course, there might be disagreements about the means for organizing that dictatorship, but what I'm getting at is that the proletariat got fractured geopolitically. Like it's like it's one thing in London when you see it everywhere. It's like the proletariat. There it is. It's another thing, a couple hundred years later, when it's been fractured and divided up and hidden away. A lot overseas, but also, like where are the factories out here in Idaho? they're not in the center of the city usually. Like they're usually, 40 minutes outside of the city, right? Like the proletarian, if we're being, and that's the thing is some people will give me grief for this. They'll say, well, we're talking about the working class in general. Cool. But if you read the Principles of Communism by Engels, he's pretty clear that there's different kinds of workers, right? And or if we were to talk about the 18th Brumaire, uh, when Marx is talking about how the peasants are kind of like a class, but they're also kind of not like a class, right? They're kind of like a class because they all have like this similar culture, they based on their mode of production or their position within the mode of production, their relations of production. Uh, but he says that they're like a sack of potatoes, right? And he says like there's you can't organize them because they're too spread out, right? And you look at The State and Revolution by Lenin, and he's talking about the industrial proletariat is like being welded into this like unified, highly disciplined force to be reckoned with. And of course, it's kind of crazy that he's saying that because he's thinking development will go that way in Russia. He's just kind of basing that off of his time elsewhere, that everywhere but Russia. And in reality, he thought that the party was going to have to fuse those people together. Like we kind of have to jump ahead and do the thing. And it's like, yeah, well, the thing that you're doing creates a lot of resentment. And if I was one of those workers, I probably would have been, sent to the gulag pretty early because I have a problem with being told where I'm going to work, how long I have to work for, right? Like it's not going to go so well for at least a person like me. Maybe if I'm on the committee, I'll be all right for at least a little while until someone has me shot. But Marxism becomes this big argument about history. It becomes this big argument about the interpretation of texts. It becomes dogmatic about these old categories being copied from old conditions and then pasted onto the new situation. And I say all of this without having any idea where you both stand. And I really, the whole time I've been talking, I feel like I'm just digging myself deeper here because the fact is you and your audience might just love the dictatorship of the proletariat and think it's our only hope. And I'm over here like I don't know. I've definitely gotten in trouble for saying these things before, but this is absolutely what I believe. And it comes out of a serious attempt to organize with Marxists over the last 10 years.
We're not dogmatic Marxist. I mean, we are also like we have a little bit of a Catholic bent. So our approach is definitely a little different, but much like you, we've learned quite a bit from Marx's analysis of capitalism, like that's good stuff. But I think we would both agree the categories have changed and it's basically a quagmire you can get stuck in and then become not very effective, I guess. I don't know. I'm speaking for myself. I was going to ask you kind of along those lines of like the class idea. Would you then, how do you see the people? There's so many people now that are employed in, they're not making anything, but they're store clerks and they're waitresses and they're, like all these different, very low paid, but still kind of somewhat white collar type jobs. I mean, would they not be sort of like the modern working class or part of it? And is that part of the problem that they're so dispersed among so many different sectors of the economy that they couldn't be organized or have a unified, coherent vision?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, they're definitely working class. I'm not one of these post-leftists who's out here talking about how it's the blue-collar workers and the petty bourgeoisie. We got to organize them. That's the only hope. I'm not saying that. And, then they like to dunk on the Starbucks workers while saying the truckers are the real workers. And it's like, okay, there is this part of me that kind of thinks that trucker is a bit more important. Like that Starbucks worker, that barista is probably just doing this as a part-time gig, could probably quit and go do anything else. That trucker is in a completely different situation, and it's one that probably requires being away from, let's say, his family, right? It probably requires not being able to be present during formative periods of his children's lives. Whereas, if we're going off of stereotypes and generalities here, then that Starbucks barista uh, probably doesn't even have kids, is probably working through college. Uh, and look, I hate this sort of line that, oh, well, that's a low skilled job. It's only meant for teenagers to get like this notch on their resume or whatever before they get into a serious job. And it's like, well, there's plenty of very old people who can't find any other work, and they are in these places. And so that's problematic. But exploitation is one thing. Oppression is another thing. And strategic ways forward that are plausible is another thing. And anybody who thinks that organizing pizza workers and Starbucks baristas is like the plausible way forward for doing something serious to counter capital, I just like I can't take it seriously,
Mhm. And so is your concept of time energy your attempt to at least put forward some sort of concept that could help maybe unite people's lived experiences, and maybe on that basis would provide some metric for what, I guess, progress or salubrious organizing would look like? Hopefully that made sense.
I got a dictionary check you now. What is salubrious?
I think it just means like life-giving.
Oh, that's awesome.
Sure, I'll look it up.
Salubrious. That's cool. Um,
One of his favorite words.
Yeah, according to the Google, it's health-giving, healthy.
cool. Yeah, all right. And so the question was, is time energy going to help, or do I think, or am I trying to, see that time energy could help people find some kind of a common basis upon which to organize?
Mhm.
Yeah, I would say so. In fact, I like the way Todd McGowan put it in his blurb on the back of the book. He said something along the lines, I don't have the book handy right now, but he said something like, the nice thing about time energy is that it's what everybody lacks, right? Like it really does get us in. He loves that sort of universality of like not what we all have in common, but like what we all lack, which obviously is in a sort of sense in common, but the structural stultification of time energy. Like if we're going to be talking big words, stultification is one of the ones that I really like to defend using, right? Because it means a person or a process dumbed down due to mundane or menial repetition, right? And so to say structural stultification is to say like the horizon of possibilities for people is foreclosed by the kinds of practices or rituals that the system demands of us, usually through the schooling system and the sort of pipeline from that into the workforce. Um, Whether or not there are some prison breaks along the way, like there's school, there's prison, and I use those as metonyms for the broader sort of ideological and repressive apparatuses, right? So
I really like, just real quick, in your book, I really liked that you made the comparison about you brought up ACAB, the organizing line about all cops are bastards. And when you say, if we use that same logic, we should say all teachers are bastards for basically the same reason.
right. It's like I know lots of cops. They're good people. I do jujitsu and Muay Thai. Guess what? Most of the people who are at that gym, I mean, I'm not most, but it's you flip a coin, they're probably in the armed forces or they're police, and at the same time, I have a lot of teachers in my life, and they're just good people all around. There's some bad apples, and then we can talk about the negative systemic effects. But yeah, exactly. And like you said, if we can say ACAB, because yeah, sure, cops are not all bastards, but the system's bad, and so then we can say it. Well, the schooling system's also bad, so we could definitely say ATAB. Yeah.
But
And that's
yeah,
I think before we started recording, when I was talking about some of these lesser known thinkers that I think are so important, and there's a lot of overlap between my interest in them and in your interests. including Wendell Berry and Ivan Illich. But I'd mentioned Gatto. Oh, and of course Christopher Lasch, right? But when I'd mentioned Gatto, you had said that you're not familiar with him, and I remember Laurie had said that as well. Yeah, John Taylor Gatto wrote Dumbing Us Down and Weapons of Mass Instruction and a really fat book by some name I cannot recall, where he basically says a lot of the stuff that he says in Weapons of Mass Instruction. Yeah, I think you can just kind of skip all the other books by him and go straight to Weapons of Mass Instruction. It's the same book over and over again, but that one I think is probably his best. And what's really special about it is some of these quotes that he pulls from the beginning of the progressive period, right, in the early 20th century. He quotes Woodrow Wilson when Woodrow Wilson was the president of Harvard. And this quote is in Time Energy, I think. It's the one where he says, "We want two classes of people, of necessity one much larger than the other. And this much larger class, it can't be, it's not going to be philosophers and scientists, right? It's going to be people who learn to take their orders." And I'm thinking I'm kind of conflating his quote that he gave to Harvard in like 1907 or 1909. I'm conflating that quote with I think it was the Carnegie Institute for Education, which had a very similar statement around that time. And so it's like the Carnegie Institute. I mean, that's the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. Though Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are on paper richer in a sort of sense that Carnegies and the Rockefellers had more influence, right? It was a lot easier to have a kind of influence back then than is possible now. And they were really the sort of vanguard of this kind of progressivism that needed to interfere in the Russian Revolution in 1918 with the Allies when they invaded. Woodrow Wilson was the one who sent them in there because he was, the first progressive president. My point is that the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, Woodrow Wilson, Frederick Winslow Taylor with his Principles of Scientific Management, Edward Bernays with his book Propaganda, and then also even W.E.B. Du Bois, who's typically thought of as some kind of a radical, some kind of a leftist. He was pretty conservative in his younger days, and I shouldn't even use that term the way that I just did. It's a bad habit from back in the day. But he was let's just say not a leftist, right? And he was very focused on racial politics. And his talented 10th essay, the reason I called it conservative is because if you read like these critical race theory readers today, they'll talk about his career, his intellectual career and his trajectory, and they'll refer to that time as more conservative because it's his attitude is the one I'm getting at with all of these other names that I just listed, which is patronizing, which is basically saying, look, some people are just better than other people. We have to help separate those people who are just better and more enlightened. We have to get them away from the lower 90%. And we have to put them in universities and get them talking to each other so that they can become more enlightened. And then they can raise up everybody else by being good influencers. I mean, that's kind of the selling point. The sort of ideological selling point. I mean, the other side of it being straight to capitalists, like, hey, by helping create this class of mediators, you'll save a lot of money and heartache by preempting working class rebellions. You can get ahead of them and make it so that they don't even happen in the first place, right? They were looking at a lot of the ruckus from the end of the previous century with the Farmers Alliance and the Populist Party, and of course looking at Europe with all the anarchist and socialist organizing, and they were just like, we can't just keep paying Pinkertons to come and beat people up and break these strikes, right? Like I'm in Coeur d'Alene right now. We just traveled here today. And in the section of The Fear of Falling by Barbara Ehrenreich, where she's talking about the ancient antagonism, that's the name of the section, she talks about how there was a miners' strike here in Coeur d'Alene and how I think she's critiquing some authors who are saying something like, oh, yeah, things were so great at that time. Labor relations were so wonderful. And she's like, yeah, what they leave out is like that miners' strike, a bunch of miners got shot. And then some of the miners came back and threw dynamite down the shaft and it killed some of the security guards. Like this was just, this is probably like 15 or 20 years before my parents moved here when I was a little kid. And so that kind of stuff creates a lot of solidarity, right? When people come and they shoot at you to break up a strike, what could create more solidarity, right? Like if they started shooting at the three of us, of course it's going to bring us closer together. And the strategy that Frederick Winslow Taylor and the likes of Woodrow Wilson they had going for them was this realization that the advanced workers in factories could be replaced by college degree having people. So typically an advanced worker was somebody who had done every aspect of the operation over the course of 20 years, built trust with all of the other workers who really knew what they were doing. And so at that point, when an advanced worker says, hey guys, let's step back, let's just step back, lock arms and step back, everything grinds to a halt because those guys know what they're doing. But when you replace those people with college educated elites, or the lesser form of that, that comes out of the state universities, then like me, let's be honest, I'm talking about people like myself, then it makes it a lot harder for labor to organize outside of some of these like teachers unions or police unions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what the question was. I'm like getting into all this stuff about the PMC because it's so important. And I think I wanted to tie it all back to the PCFM. And I think that's where I was going with this, but I just want to check in to make sure I'm on track.
Yeah, I mean, I think it started with, are you hoping time energy is this concept that kind of universally speaks to people?
Thank you. Yes. I said that I kind of bracket out politics. A way of saying that is that I am a political phenomenologist, which doesn't mean I just describe politics, right? I think people often think that phenomenology means just describing things the way that they appear. But it's this term bracketing that Husserl gets a lot of traction with, which is to say you take the average everyday sort of attitude, mindset, mode, perspective, interpretive habits, what have you, and you bracket against that, which is to say you counter, you exaggerate in the other direction, right? And because everything is political, in scare quotes, and because everyone tries to make everything political, which it arguably is, I nonetheless want to bracket it because politics assumes we know what the intractable disagreements are, right? It assumes that we know what the intractable disagreements are. It assumes we know what the situation is, and it tends to assume we know what should be done, right? And it doesn't usually have the self-awareness that that is an assumption. It's instead just, it is this way. And so I've been in a period of what I call moratorium since 2020, right? So Super Tuesday, Bernie folding, the whole field folding into Biden, and then Bernie taking that back seat after South Carolina. I was like, okay, I'm done, guys. I can't keep doing this. And it was partially because of the rioting and the looting and the people saying, well, see, this is the revolution. This is what it's going to be, and I just couldn't see any hope in it. And I already lost some of my more rosy-eyed love for Bernie as he had, especially in this second run, appealed more and more to the identitarian interests that are kind of the sort of sacred groups prioritized by the Democrats, and that he had stopped going after Democrats and instead started focusing it all against Trump. So it became very like hashtag resistance. And to see him sort of just bend the knee to BLM, which is, you know, the Bank of America and stuff like that, to see him bend the knee to BLM and act like COVID was the worst thing in the world, it was really a sort of wake up call for me. And I guess anybody who knows much Marx probably is rolling their eyes going, see, Dave, you really are a sock dem. You had hope for Bernie. And it's like, no, I had hope that people could start to think of themselves as a working class again. That's what I had hope for. But instead, 7 years of struggle got liquidated and laundered into Democratic Party politics, right? So Timenergy doesn't come out of like a hopeful place of me saying, everyone, if we could just all organize around our shared lack and fight for Timenergy because that's the good thing, well, then we'll all be able to have all the things that we want. It's meant to be a lot more of a, hey, this is the thing that no one's talking about, child slavery and Timenergy. Like these things are just left out because it's a lot easier to focus on these more imaginative and exciting identitarian issues on the horizon of possibilities, mediating the relations of production, but never actually get down to the mode of production itself. And for me, it's like, well, I kind of want to just, with Timenergy, say, look, all the stuff you're talking about sounds important. It sounds like you really care about it. But if you do care about the good life, if you do care about justice, if you do care about truth, if you do care about excellence, if you do care about humanity, well, then there's this very interesting thing that we all don't have and that is also not being prioritized. And it's not even a part of the discussion right now. And so it's meant really just to kind of force home for people who are seriously inquiring into the situation, trying to figure out what must be done, a realization of how far off course we are if that's not even on the agenda.
So what would a family, like, let's take a just concrete instance, what would the family life look like if people had the kind of time and energy that you wanted? You have that combination. And maybe how does the agrarian life, the modern agrarian life, is that a vision or a possible example of what people would do with that? Or just like, because I know that you've talked about, and I agree with you that our current situation has us working for a lot of things other than ourselves and our families and friends and human relations, and it's kind of like split up the most important things in our lives, right? So let's just kind of leap into the possible Dave perfect future, and what would the family life look like? And yeah, just give us your vision.
My vision is one that I hope will crystallize between 2020 and, well, it's like a 30-year project, really. So in 2020, I wrote a book called Waypoint, and I said, instead of trying to write to everybody or write in a way that would be publicly accessible to everybody or try to present some, real contribution where I'm like, this is the solution, everybody. I'm instead going to say the intergenerational conditions for people being able to really cultivate themselves and find their voice and calling and kind of where they fit in and how to give back. Like the conditions for that have deteriorated or fallen apart. And I am a product of that broken system. And I have to give myself time instead of being like, I'm an activist who has all the solutions, guys, listen to me. I have to instead like become a student, right? But I have a master's degree and but that's not a contradiction. I I can teach and be a lifelong student. So what's the rush, right? And I say, part of the rush is like the world's burning and everything's falling apart. So of course we feel this need to do something, to posit some kind of a plan. But then I also say, and this was like a really relieving realization, if we don't have time, then we really don't have time to act like we don't have time, right? This is something that produces immature approaches, like people jump the gun in a lot of ways. And if something's worth doing, it's worth doing right. But at the same time, we can also just turn that right back around and say that if something's worth doing right, it might be worth doing twice. And so maybe you should just try to break it as quick as possible so that you can figure out what to do better next time, right? And so I'm kind of always torn between those two approaches on any given project or idea. But what I said was I'm going to give myself 30 years to write to people who will be 25 years old in 30 years. And I'm going to spend the next 5 years developing myself to write a book to their parents, which would be my peers, right? So I figured I'm not going to have kids for another 5 years. I'm going to spend the next 5 years preparing myself to have kids and really to build up a network of other people who are teachers and homeschool parents who care about this future generation that we're going to be bringing into existence. And so that was 5 years ago. And so here I am in the 5th year. I have to write this next book, that is to those peers, really parents who kind of are a broad swath of humanity because they're not all my age. So just this swath of humanity who is going to be having these children. And so what does it look like to nurture children when you are aware of the importance of time energy? I think that's what you're asking. And towards the end of my time energy book, I do, I think the chapter's title is something like, is homeschooling the answer? And my basic take on homeschooling is it shouldn't be easy to answer that question, because every house is different. Everybody's situation is different. Everyone's talents are different. It probably doesn't do much harm for a lot of people to be homeschooled, but also it can cause a lot of harm for all kinds of reasons we could get into. But one of the bigger problems outside of lack of socialization and super insular families and blah, 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 is the way that the schooling system gets reproduced in the actual household. So that, I use the example of this girl I knew who she wanted to learn. She really wanted to learn video, like how to make video. And her parents were, they're homeschooling this family, and they were like, yeah, you should teach her. She really wants to learn. But then like the 2 or 3 times that we tried, like we only had like 40 minutes to do it before she was like rushed off to go take care of her younger siblings. And then she had to do some cleanup work, and then she had to do some homework. And this girl was like being worked full time from the beginning of the day until the end of the day. There was never, ever any skole, right? Skole being the root for school that means leisure, the active leisure. And I think that this is part necessity. The mother of that household was just super overwhelmed and overworked and had a lot of stuff to do. And so I'm not blaming her. But that is kind of what homeschooling often will do, is it means that a mother ends up doing a lot more than just being a mother. She's also the principal. She's also teaching multiple subjects. She's potentially running a homestead, right? So it's like, that's a lot of jobs. And I really do like the idea of homeschooling co-ops. I think Catholics are especially good at this, from what I hear. Like they're a lot better about doing homeschooling co-ops than a lot of these Protestant sects of homeschoolers. At least that's my impression based off of conversations with people throughout the last 20 years. So what would the ideal future look like? I mean, I'm moving to a farm this year. It's back to my parents' farm. They're entering their 70s. My wife and I want to take the farm over and have children starting next year. And so, we're really excited. And I know we showed you a little bit about that when we had you on stream. But the research questions are myriad. And, it's a work in progress. And I have provisional ideas for large-scale structural change, but I also don't really think my opinion matters that much right now. Like, people aren't lined up out the door asking me what to do. You both are here asking me. It's very nice of you, but like, it's not like kings or emperors care about what I want, and there's no democratic process that I can think of that's working in this country that could execute the kinds of ideas that I have. So I'm kind of just looking ahead, and I think it's a kind of a standard progressive move is to say the future, the children of the future, they will save us, right? But usually they're thinking about like children like immediately and students immediately. And of course, students is like this rotating door, constant turnover. If you're at a university, you keep getting older, but they all stay the same age, right? It's that interesting thing. But I'm talking about like interpolating a specific generation and really developing ourselves to work with it. I don't know. It's kind of a different approach. And on the one side, there's the farm and sort of local focused kind of work. And then there's the bigger question about large scale structural change and what kinds of policies or even political programs or new ways of organizing could bring us what we call at Theory Underground T3 institutions, right? T3 institutions or T cubed institutions, T to the third power. They're the three T's. It's time, energy, tutelage, and talent, right? And so it's like, if you have talent, you can discover, if you have time, energy, you can discover your talent and it can be cultivated under the tutelage of others, right? That's the basic idea. And of course, that's the idea of school, like the dignified sort of noble idea of school. So as far, I don't want to leave this off without saying anything. So I'll at least say, one of those sort of provisional ideas I like to throw out there is like, well, look, we live in this system that's duopolistic. It's a duopoly. The two sides are constantly disproportionately reacting to one another in ways that egg the other side on, and it's a good little business cycle for them all. This is it's job security. And so immigration is one of these things where it's like, everybody agrees you can't just have no border. Everybody except for 1% of the population is like aware that you have to have a border. But obviously, like, one party is thought of as the one that's tough on borders, and the other one's thought of as the one that's very permissive when it comes to borders. And of course, sometimes that was true, like Biden telling Texas, you can't keep people out. You're not allowed to. It's like, okay, well, the back and forth over guns or abortion or borders, these kinds of back and forths, I call them forever issues. And I'm not saying that they have to be forever issues, but they're framed in a way that makes them forever issues. And so a simple sort of, I mean, it's not that simple, but something that might get around the current tug of war over immigration and the border would be to have T3 institutions built along the border, to have places that people actually want to go to when they don't have a good place to be, but they want to develop themselves and their families to find a place in society to plug into. So like, these would be transitional places, but they could also be places that people stay if they wanted to, right? And they could be places where you learn the language of the place that you're going so that you're not going to be isolated to some ghetto, right? Like this, it's absolutely insane that there's this whole conversation around, like, one side supposedly saying, learn English, or learn American. and then the other side saying, that's crazy. We should just all be speaking multiple languages. And it's like, well, of course we should all be speaking multiple languages. But in the meantime, you're trying to rush people in here to pick your strawberries, and they're not going to be able to speak the language, which makes them easier to exploit. That's insane. And so having T3 institutions along the border, places where people can have their time energy, can discover and cultivate their talents under tutelage, and do so with their families without being split up, and then being able to find where they can plug into, where they will be wanted, real contributing members to the society. Like that, I think that approach appeals to the better angels of both progressives and conservatives in this country. I've never said it to anyone where they were like, that's a terrible idea, I hate that. Like, everyone's like, huh. And my point is simply this: it's a no-brainer. It's not like some genius thing. It's just an actual no-brainer that comes from saying, well, what would be something that surpasses this deadlock? What would be something that appeals to the better angels of both sides instead of just the actual sort of rabid dogs on both sides?
Mm-hmm. But these kinds of solutions are not, when you put them out, both sides of the racket don't want ideas like that to fly. And yeah, and it's very expensive. I mean, we're part of the Catholic worker movement, and as you were describing it, I was thinking about like Peter Maurin, he came up with a program in the Great Depression, and it was roundtable discussions for the clarification of God thought, houses of hospitality where people could get taken care of, and agronomic universities where people could quit being unemployed in the cities and learn how to farm. Now, there's a lot of devils in those details, but yeah, very commonsensical, and yet, it's not going to allow the capital to flow in the way that our economy needs it to, right?
Right. And that's where, it's like there's this part of me that says, yeah, I want everyone to be able to have their time energy, but also I immediately want to have a life, and I want to be able to care for and love some people, and I want those people to be able to have time energy. And so there is like this more conservative turn in my development that's just kind of, it's like, well, I am pragmatically parochial. Yes, would I like these things for everybody? Absolutely. I don't see a real way forward as far as like making that happen, though, right? And you've all had Benjamin Studebaker on, right? And his The Way Is Shut and the crisis of legitimacy in liberal democracies. I think that these are the problems, and that there is no obvious solution right now. And so it's kind of just on us to be in a more defensive, localist, pragmatic, parochial approach, hopefully with some thought towards larger scale structural change in the future. But really, like, is that my responsibility? Is that totally my responsibility? And is that an obligation on me that I need to prioritize over, say, my children? I think that that's one of the wild things about the progressive PMC in America, is like this idea that you're a bad person if you prioritize those who are closest to you. I just think that that's like a non-starter, It's like, I'm sorry, keep shaming people. It's not going to change anything. We want to have a life.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Yeah, you can't have community at all. You can't have a family. You can't have community at all if you don't focus on the people closest to you. That is just the way it works. Sorry, though. Spencer, go ahead.
I think it's partly a testament to, when you were talking about the various like internecine fights in Marxism, where it's like, you didn't say this, but I was thinking it, like, some of these people are like the conservative caricature of what all Marxists are. Like that's the Jordan Peterson art, just possessed by resentment against existence and other people. And similarly, yeah, every once in a while you run into these people where like they claim they love humanity, but do they even love their family or their neighbors? They probably don't. And then really makes you wonder, do they love humanity? Um, but let's pivot
They love
toward,
history lessons.
yeah, they love school, they love teachers, they love social workers, hate cops. Uh, yeah. Um, so I guess let's transition to talking about farming. And how does your interest in time energy and all of the critical theory, how do you square that with your interest in agriculture and localism, I guess?
Yeah. So I'm kind of the prodigal child in a lot of ways. You know, I was raised on a homestead by a pioneer woman who's got uh like she runs on grit and has unending respect from every woman who's ever met her, right? My mom is an absolute powerhouse, and she's very iconic. You know, she's a very small woman, and she's just a powerhouse. You know, like when I think of her, when I was growing up, I think of her rototilling while pregnant, like 8 months pregnant. She's out there rototilling, you know. I think of her like, I think of her uh, like we had this. It wasn't a. Was it a goat? What was it, a goat or is it a sheep? I think it was one of those black belly ones, and it's got the big horns. We named it Buckwheat. It was an orphan, and so we raised it, you know. But it was way too friendly with us because we raised it from a small age, and it liked to run up on people and smack them real hard with its horns. And I think my mom was like 8 months pregnant when she turned around because she heard something and got smacked right in the stomach, you know, by this thing. And it had come running across the whole property. And so I just say all of that, you know. Also, one time that thing attacked me, and I wrestled it, and I won, and I was so proud. But like, you know, outside of little stories like that, I was the person who chopped the chickens' heads off. I moved the cages that were invented by Joel Salatin. You know what I mean? And I hated it. I did not like cutting chickens' heads off, and I did not like living out in the middle of nowhere. I didn't have any sort of romanticized relation to nature. Uh, at least not after we moved there. Like when I was living in California at the age of 5 years old, when everyone was talking about it, I imagined that we would have a river and that there'd be other children and, you know, all these different things that just were not true. It was a lot more isolated and desolate. And there were trees, but they were like Jack Pine. It's not like it was a really amazing part of some forest somewhere. It was more like a part of North Idaho that most people would probably not even notice as they drive by. Um, and so I frame myself as some kind of prodigal son here because somewhere between a couple years into college and now, I really started to think more and more about regenerative agriculture. And it started with permaculture, and it started with sort of a post-colonial, anti-settler, more like left-coded, you know, way of thinking. And eventually I read The Unsettling of the United States by Wendell Berry, and that was a huge, huge factor for me. I read a little Vandana Shiva, that unlocked some stuff for me. And it just made me like really realize, wow, my mom, she's she's on to something, you know, and she has her own reasons for why she does what she does. Like that, you know, she'll say why she does it, but then like at the end of the day, there's like the way we rationalize things, and then there's just loving doing this thing. And I think the reasons have changed over time, but it hasn't changed the fact that she loves to take something from nothing and make it something special. Whether she's talking about a flower garden or a hoop house full of tomatoes and peppers, it doesn't matter. She likes to make the world a better place. in a way that is objective, like you can see it. And she'll always say, you're not building soil and restoring the earth if there's no earthworms, right? So like that's the true measure of our soil, is like you stick a shovel in and turn it over. Do you see earthworms? And she goes, yes. On this property, yes, you do. Because we're not just growing one thing, we're growing a lot of things, and they do rotate. And the chickens do come through and do all the things that they're supposed to do. And they get to live out their telos, or their essence, right? And so I think that's all very special. I met Joel Salatin. I brought him to Boise State. My mom came down from North Idaho for that. It was a special event. And I met a lot of cool people through doing that. I was doing stuff with the local eco village, and I was, if you had talked to me back then, it was all very optimistic and very like, oh, community, and we can all just do this together, and it's all about uniting the life of the mind with the work of the hands, and building soil and building human culture, right? And of course, like, I think that part of me is still there, but I'm a lot less optimistic, or a bit more cynical, jaded maybe, because of attempts trying to organize and realizing, oh, people really like to show up and talk a lot and make a lot of demands and have a lot of ideas and do nothing outside of those meetings. And then, so there's the people who do so it's like, there's people who do 90% of the things that they do outside of meetings. And then the meeting is really just to get on the same wavelength with other people who are getting stuff done. And then there are people who think that the meeting is the point, right? And because I was very egalitarian, I was very like ideologically liberal in a way that I couldn't have even said what that meant at the time. I really just thought, yeah, we're all individuals and we're all equal, and democracy is the way forward. And because we don't want to be bad and hierarchical, I was like kind of swept up by all of that stuff. Yet at the end of the day, I was the one always left holding the bag, right? I mean, not at the eco village. There was a person who was always left holding the bag at the eco village. So I was doing the things that I was doing, trying to organize what became the Victory Farm Center for the Humanities. And then there was this woman whose name I'll just leave out for now. Let's call her Gracie. And so Gracie, she's the eco village person, and she tried so hard. Because I knew her for years, and so I watched her try so hard at the same time that I was trying so hard to make things horizontalist, to make things democratic, and it's just so exhausting. And for what? Because Thomas Jefferson said that we're all created equal, now we have to organize a different way. I just don't understand. Like, I'm pretty sure that there are people who show up for the meeting, and then there are people who are leaving the things that they're doing, 100 things that they're juggling, to be at the meeting. And the thing is the kind of people who are capable of getting a lot done, they get weeded out from the process really, 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 really quick when they hear these people just yapping. And it's like, I don't think I was very attuned to it yet, but now I'm a lot quicker to be like, oh, you're not going to do anything. You're just here to talk. I can see that. And so nowadays I try to set up effort buffers and cool downs, right? These are organizational concepts that I just use. Like, I'm sure you probably have your own words for something similar, but the point is like, if you don't set up effort buffers, then everybody just has instantaneous access to you, or they think that they do. An effort buffer says, well, you're going to have to do something. You actually have to do something before you get to me. And so, I mean, an application is a bureaucratic effort buffer. But if you were, say, running a farm, it could be like, we're not going to have an interview. Here's a shovel. Now just do the bed, like get the bed turned, and then we'll see how that goes. There's graduated senses for the term effort buffer, and then a cool down is just, people come in really excited, and then if you put them on cool down for a while, and then they're still excited, and they're still there for it, well then great. But what tends to happen is we overestimate our abilities. And in the book, I use that example of the kid at the buffet who just stacks the plate. Little me. I'm like, oh, I'm going to eat all of this stuff. And then I'm like halfway through the plate. And then I'm like, there's no way I could finish this. And then the parents, you're going to finish it, And it's like, oh, I definitely overestimated my capacities here. And so I'm not trying to blame the people who show up and just talk and can't follow through on actually getting things done. I'm not trying to blame them. And maybe I should. Maybe I should bend the bow back the other direction and actually start blaming them. But my tendency is to not blame them. My tendency is to say, people, their heart is in the right place. They really do want to make the world better. And they get really excited. And so then they overcommit and they underestimate their actual time energy lack. And, like New Year's is a great example of that. Everybody makes their New Year's goals. And when you're looking at the calendar, you're like, look at how much time there is in the week. But then once you're actually in the week, you're like, oh, I'm exhausted now. Like I'm just actually exhausted now. Right. And so then you have to change the whole schedule around. And there's just these certain points in the month, in the week, in the year, when you have like this surplus energy. And from that point, you project into the future, make a bunch of plans. But then, of course, that energy, like it's not reliable. And so you don't have time energy. And what ends up happening is it all falls out from under you. And so I'm trying to say, I'm not blaming people. I'm saying that's what's going on with them. And sure, to some degree, there are things that we can do as people, as individuals. And maybe that's a whole thing we could get into with this conversation. But for now, I just want to say, yeah, my assumption was, and to some degree still is, like, this is a bigger structural issue with people having to prioritize necessary labor.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think the term you use in your book is like imagination stomachs. That
Yeah.
buffet thing, people imagine they're far more, and I'm very guilty of this, imagining I'm capable of accomplishing a lot more than I'm capable of doing, as it turns out.
I think there is, I think you make an excellent point that part of the problem is the context that we're in. We don't have as much time and energy as we need to actually like really devote. But also there is this, I want to sort of connect with this at the ideational level and be sort of emotionally a part of it, but I don't actually really like to work. So there's that too, I think. Like, I resonate with your, that point you made about, I mean, I don't know, like, if you find somebody who's willing to like use the shovel, right? Then that might be somebody that you can work with, right? And that might be there for more than just that meeting. So that's important because I recognize both, but for a lot of folks, like, they get into this because it is kind of romantic on the surface and it sounds wonderful. And if only we could do that, but then they've never really encountered what it takes to do it. And when they do, they're like, but that's not for me.
This is why I think some more unapologetically normative discourse is necessary. And so I've only really started owning that realization more recently. And what I mean by normative in this sense is just, a sort of moralizing discourse of like, not quite like thou shalt not versus thou shalt. I'm not talking like I come through like a general sending marching orders, but more like pedagogically. I don't come in the classroom and just start spitting facts at them, and I don't just walk them through slides or whatever. Usually I know what concepts I'm thinking I want to convey, but then I also work with the room, and then I work the room. And sometimes that means that I take a table and I throw it if I need to. And I do. And I do all kinds of like weird antics to just make sure I literally have everybody the whole time, right? Now maybe I'm painting a picture that's a little too extreme. It's not always like that. But it's at least with one of these classes, it's really working. I've got like 20 students and they're all attending and they're all doing all the homework. There's not a single one of them that's not doing the homework and that's not attending. And then they stay after. Like the whole classroom stays like 10 minutes after, which is wild at Boise State. But what I mean with this like more normative discourse is like I've started to kind of talk about our worm selves and our reptile selves versus our higher human capacities, right? Like this is like a way of talking about the fact that we are in part animals and we have a lot in common with worms. We seek pleasure and we avoid pain, right? That's something we have in common with shrimp. They don't even have a central nervous system, but they have that in common with us. Do you think they like pain? No, obviously they do not like pain. Are they conscious of it the way we are? I don't know. Ask a philosopher of consciousness. But we at least can say, yeah, like they pursue pleasure, they avoid pain. And so there is this level where we're all the same at this worm level. And it's human dignity is partially at that worm level too. Like the cry out in pain that calls to us and that moves us, like that is something dignified. There's something special there, in the other that we're being appealed to, we're being called upon to help. And so I'm not saying that the worm is disgusting and it's the worst thing ever, but obviously we're more than just that, right? And so it's like media, advertising, and the state, politics, business, all of these forces are converging on trying to appeal to our worm selves, right? So that we're constantly being gamed at the level of fear, but also like, ooh, desire. You want this now, don't you? And so I'm talking, I can talk that way, and the students are like nodding their heads, like they're following along. And if I feel like I'm not getting them all, then I'll switch it up and I'll talk about like, like the worst week that you've had in your whole year when you're laying in your crusty bed, scrolling TikTok, eating pizza and pie, or whatever you're doing from bed. Your whole life is kind of centered around this dumpy room, right? And it's like, they all know this thing, right? Like it's, in the post-class fractured mass, like everybody is sort of in this mental space of the niches. Like we think that we can't talk to other people because every time we try to talk about anything, any one of our references is going to be over everybody else's heads unless they're consuming the same content that we are. And I'm very interested in speaking to the interstices between those niches. But that doesn't mean you don't speak to the niches, right? And so you can concretize these abstractions like worm-like being, moving from popular niches, like from this one to that one to that one. So I mentioned TikTok. Well, not everybody's on TikTok. 50% of my students in both classes are on TikTok, but not everybody else is. Some people are binging Netflix. Some people just lay in bed and feel bad about how they can't do their homework, and they don't do anything on social media. Like, so that, and I know this because we're all having conversations about that stuff. But the reptile self is the part of yourself that can prey on the worms. And, this is what it means to become an exploiter as opposed to the exploited. Now, I like Wendell Berry's distinction between nurture and exploitation. And, his point is that divide exists within us all as well as between us. And I love how he goes there instead of like, oh, it's oppressed groups versus oppressing groups. So, this was supposed to be some kind of a correcting measure against the New Left's way of framing everything in terms of oppressor versus oppressed. I don't think they ever got the memo, sadly. But this point about exploitation versus nurture, well, your worm self is exploited by your reptile self, right? The question is like, do you have higher human capacities? that are not reducible to worms and reptiles. And of course, people start thinking about it and they're like, of course I do. And it's like, well, what are the conditions of possibility for nurturing those higher human capacities? And where I like to go is this whole conversation about solitude and solicitude. Maybe we'll get into it. But I don't want to lose this thread. And so to kind of tie it together here, the point is about normative discourse and how, as a former leftist, I used to really avoid normative statements and moralizing. I was very Nietzsche and Marx pilled on these things. I was like, oh no, yeah, that's moralistic. And it's like, no, but these students would coast through, a lot of them would coast through life until things just fell apart eventually. If somewhere along if not for the fact that somewhere along the way, someone throws a bucket of ice water in their face or figuratively slaps them upside the head and says, hey, you there. Who am I speaking to? Which part of you am I speaking to? Am I talking to you at your lowest point, or am I speaking to you in terms of your higher capacities? There's this part of you that beats yourself up for not being that self that you want to be, right? I want to be on that person's side, right? And so, no, I'm not going to let you coast through and just throw it away and waste your parents' money and use this special time that you have here to really think deeply about things. To lose that. No, and I really pushed them hard and tried to scare them out of my class in the first week to just be like, I'm not going to be easy. I promise you will be challenged, but I also promise it will be rewarding, right? And I think I lost like 25 students between the two classes. Like I did go hard, and 3 of them went straight to rate my professor and said awful things about me. But the ones who remain are like really there for it, and they're saying like, this is the only class that I'm learning anything in. I think about it every day. And the kinds of students who are saying that, like, they look like stereotypical, like sorority girls and fraternity bros, right? The kinds of people that your typical, I'll just say that my younger self wouldn't have tried so hard to speak to or work with. And the point is like there is something in all of us that can be appealed to and worked with. And so bringing it all back around there, Laurie, yeah, to say it's a systemic structural issue. They don't have time, energy, their appetites, their expectations, their projection. It's all just off. They need to be more realistic. No, also, I think this sort of normative discourse is necessary. This like, hey, you know what? We're being screwed. We're worms and reptiles. They're cultivating us that way, or they're instrumentalizing us that way. We need to reverse cultivate against the instrumentalization to rise up out of this. And we got to work with one another, the others in us who actually want to strive for something better. And I think people can get excited about that thing if it doesn't just sound like a canned pep talk, you know?
I think so. Yeah. Or at least, yeah, a certain amount of person that's ready to transcend being a worm and a reptile and get fired up by that. So to what extent is your farm endeavor an attempt for you to self-actualize, live out your deepest humanity? I guess, what are you hoping to accomplish by doing this? And what lessons are you taking away from your past quote unquote failures? Other than, you can't just treat everybody as equals, and you just have to have endless meetings to get on the same page.
I think that there might be nothing more important than loving and raising a family, that there might be nothing more important than having children who will constantly defeat your projections, your expectations, and be completely different than you imagined, and being able to love them in a way that you can't love other people's kids. Like as a teacher, you can't love other people's kids the way that you could love your own kids. And because eventually they're gonna be like, okay, stay away from my kid. Like you just, that's my kid. You can't like be my kid's best friend. And it's like, yeah, of course not. But somewhere between 20 27, and now I just really started to think like, quick aside, I always wanted a vasectomy. I always said I would never have children. I was like a little hippie kid who was like, we should all be polyamorous and never be jealous, and we can all just love each other, right? And so at some point though, I was like, oh, I really want to be able to deeply love and be there for somebody, right? And so to me, that's what the farm's about, is like, I don't want to raise those kids inside of a plastic oven. It's just like disgusting. Like the conditions that most people live in are filthy. I mean, they look pristine, but they're actually disgusting. And I know that that's good soil to like run around on with bare feet. I know that that's fresh air, and I know that that their immune systems will be exposed to millions of microorganisms, and that they will be that their unconscious will not be this institutionalized incentive structure that comes out of this factory farm schooling system, right? Like that alone is enough of a reason. I don't need bigger reasons, but there are also a lot of bigger reasons that we could get into that I think are special. But the only one I'll focus on for now is just to say, like, the idea of being a lifelong learner is something that I get a lot of mileage out of. I always wish that I could go back and do all of my school all over again, because when I was homeschooled, but my mom, she doesn't have like the heart or mindset of a teacher. She's a pioneer woman and she's a beast. She's hardcore, but she's not like a teacher. Like, that's not her thing. That never was, and I don't think that reflects poorly on her. But there was no teacher in the house, and so she could get us only so far, right? And so I didn't learn to read until I was 12, and then it was like, here's these books, read them. There were no exams, there were no quizzes, there were no knowledge checks, there was no oral back and forth like, okay, Dave, what are you learning? What's going on here? And so, I'd kind of look at this book for a couple hours because, I'd get in trouble if I wasn't pretending to look at it. And then I'd go do my cursive homework, making Bible verses in cursive. And then I'd go, oh, let's do some math. And at the point that math introduced letters, I was like, I don't know how to do this. I can't make sense of this. And mom was like, well, then just wait till dad gets home. Of course, he gets home like way after dark, like 10 o'clock at night. And it's like, I'm not allowed to go play until I do my homework. And so I would cheat. And so I just cheat my way through math. And it was, I was a little rebel. And there were positives and negatives that came from that. And a lot of the negatives, it took me a long time to live through those, the cumulative effects of, for instance, cheating and lying. But the dream, I guess, is to be able to really think about math and science and art and literature and do it with children. Like there's something, specifically my children, but also, I mean, that's the thing, is like, if I have some kind of ability to inspire other people, if other people can kind of feed off that energy, if other people can, because I'm doing it, they get excited and they want to do it too. Fact is a lot of people are already doing it, but their spark is getting snuffed out, right? Like you think of that homesteading mother who's doing this in isolation, and yeah, that spark is being snuffed out. In Theory Underground's target demographic has been the worker with earbuds who has lots of disposable time working at a place like Amazon or driving trucks places. And so that person's able to listen to long live streams and is able to listen to long form lectures and seminars, and which is good for me because I like to go long and I like to go hard, and I like to assume that demographic because I used to be that person. But the audience you assume and the people that you speak to changes you. if you move from speaking to this audience to speaking to that audience, I think it changes you. You know, like a really easy example of that would be live streaming on YouTube versus live streaming on Twitch. Like it didn't take very long for me to realize Twitch was completely changing me at like this, not at the level of my disposition, but just in terms of how I had to um sort of mediate between myself and the audience, right? Because of the medium itself was so different than YouTube. And I think, you know, it's the same thing. It's like if you're speaking to Christians, if you're speaking to Marxists, if you're speaking to political theorists, if you're speaking to people who care about regenerative agriculture, it's very different than if you're just assuming an audience of whoever. And so, like, say, just Democrats or just Republicans or whatever it would be. I think it was 5 years ago that I was like, yeah, I want to be able to serve a community of teachers within the schooling system, the kind who have a flame and they have a lot of sparks that they ignite in their students, but their own flame is perishing. It's being snuffed out because of all of the busy work and being stretched thin and all of these things. To be able to work with those people, to be able to say, this is a place you come to reignite that spark or to feed that flame. This is not a place for children. This is a place for people who are responsible for children, but they need to sort of be around other people who are trying to do this, right? So those kinds of people within the institutions, and then those people who've lost hope on those institutions and are currently working outside of them, often mothers or fathers in sort of homeschooling environments. But I think when I had that realization, I was like, yeah, I'm not even close to being ready to do that. And I still don't think I'm ready, and I won't be anytime soon. But that is the trajectory that I'm headed in.
Well, and I guess to get to my main provocative question, because I'd been listening to a decent amount of you getting really ready for the Benjamin Studebaker thing, and then listening to you talk with Laurie, you know, I'd seen you like berate your audience, which I like the specifically the Cretans in the chat or whatever. There's a reason I couldn't manage such a thing. But then you were talking about potentially like hosting farm galas and something about $500 carrot dishes. Does this ring a bell?
Oh, yeah.
And then I just had a hard time imagining you not having contempt for the bougie clientele who's
Oh, okay.
simply supporting the farm. And I say this, I've been in a very similar adjacent track insofar as like I've been doing the farming for like a decade. I've kind of stepped away and turned into a contractor as I've gotten burned out and only lost money doing farming. But
Mm.
I always had the farming, and then I was doing all sorts of listening to audiobooks and podcasts. And where I very early hit a wall with the farming is it was like, okay, am I going to like 100% commit to farming? No more earbuds. I'm going to fully focus on what it takes to be a successful farmer. I'm going to have to pretend I give a shit about showing up early to a farmer's market and chit-chatting, and I'm going to have to become like a good accountant, and I'm going to have to, in all sorts of ways, my drive would have to overcome me being in farming because I believed in sort of the vision and the politics and the ecology, not because I believed in all of the dirty details of what it took to be a farmer.
Mm.
And my step back has been, okay, I'll be a contractor in my day job and we'll keep this Catholic worker homestead going. So that's all kind of my background to where it hit me when I pictured you like tinkling the cocktails and thinking the guests. I'm like, could he do that? I couldn't do it, but maybe you could. What do you say to that?
That's a really good point. Um, Typically, anything I say is just a sort of provisional sort of placeholder for something better, you know? So it's
Sure.
like I could say my plan is A, B, or C, and then just use like algebraic placeholders. But instead, I put some kind of an image on it that gives a person some kind of an idea in the direction it's headed. But in reality, the moment I actually try it, I'm going to realize a whole bunch of things and then change up how I'm doing it. And so, the Early Risers Breakfast Club that I'm doing in Boise, Idaho, is an example of that. I'm experimenting with trying to work with a different kind of demographic than what I'm usually working with. Not because I want to stop working with the people that I'm working with, but because I do want to work with people who aren't like, oh my God, $50 is a lot of money. Yeah, no, I would like to work with like busy professionals who are experts in their fields, who know that that anything that's quality is going to require some money, right? Like that's the nice thing about almost any petty bourgeois sort of enterprise is like the people, any artisan or craft-based type of middle class enterprise is catering to a people who have a kind of disposable income, and they're looking for something special, something different, right? And your main point is like, well, wouldn't you resent them? And it's like, I could, I don't resent like Democrats or Republicans uh, when they're all in a big group, but talking amongst themselves, and I'm there. I don't feel threatened, and I don't have disdain for them unless I have to be there for like 2 weeks. Like there's some point after which I'm just like, oh my gosh, I can't do this anymore. Like, because you guys aren't taking notes when I talk. You don't think that I have anything to offer you. And it's always this tit for tat kind of discourse where it's like, what's your take? Here's my take. What's your take? Oh, you're getting excited about this. Yeah, I am excited about this stuff. I live and breathe it. What are you talking about? And it's gotten to the point where I like to say that, if Baudrillard said that Disneyland exists so that America can think that it's not Disneyland, like it's contained over there and the rest of the world's all, real stuff. I also like to say Disney adults exist so that Democrats and Republicans feel like they're doing real politics when they go to the voting booth. Right. And so it's like, yeah, and especially if you watch Why Left with me and Benjamin Studebaker, then you're going to see that I am, I'm constantly kind of stuck in this space between wanting to speak to people like that, but then also being like, I'd rather talk about them, and it's not the kind of podcast you'd want to show your typical Democrat or Republican, right? Really, we're talking about normies. We're talking about, and of course, I define normie in a slightly different way than how a lot of people do, which is just anybody who's not into the niche stuff I'm into, right? So like, from a certain standpoint, you would both be normies to me regarding X, Y, or Z things, but you're obviously not when it comes to certain theoretical things or the regenerative agriculture. But yeah, we all inhabit niches now, and everybody outside of your niches is normies. And the problem with theory, especially critical theory, especially leftism, is this: it is a niche. All of the niches are boutique consumer demographics. But this niche is the niche whose identity is negating all of the other niches, right? It's the one who's like, oh, you like football. Oh, you like wrestling. Oh, you like guns. Oh, you like, just go down the line. It's like, it's like the little boutique consumer demographic that has a reputation with all of the other ones of being against them all, right? Even though, of course, you'll get like these little social justice insurgencies into these other niches, and then the fandoms will have their little flame wars. But eventually people who are into collecting stamps want to go back to collecting stamps, and they're going to get tired of all that, right? And I'm interested in deconstructing that part of me to some extent, to whatever extent I can correct against it, that is so prone to judgment and living in negation against other people's enjoyment. I genuinely don't want to be that way. But also, to some extent, I should be able to vent about the situation as I see it. I don't know. It's a hard place to be in. But I'm definitely a person in transition. I don't know where I'm going to end up. But what I'm doing with the tours this year, what I'm doing with the early risers breakfast clubs as part of the ground game this year, what I'm talking about with like these special dinners, it's not just about catering to say wealthy people or something like that. It's humans across the board are hungry for inspiration and what Marx called spiritual nourishment. That's people want it. And if I as an educator am incapable of speaking outside of the niches where I feel most comfortable, then what am I really doing?
No, and it's a question I ask myself a lot too, because I guess, and maybe too up front, and again, you were doing the interviews with Benjamin Studebaker, and there's all this talk about the way being shut, and we're all post class and fractured, and then I guess to me where it was just to me there's a general vibe of like sort of exhaustion, our possibilities are foreclosed, and then I've lived that out with farming, and and then you're like, oh, but the farming will work out. I'm like, well, even by your own theory, it's not obvious that that would happen. And then I've lived it out. Again, I don't know. This feels almost like a gotcha question, and I'm putting you on the spot. I'm really just trying to have a conversation about yeah, I don't know. Again, what do you beyond the contempt too? So there's that question, and then there's just to me what I've lived out is like the burnout of it too. Like forget about your issues, my issues with the clientele. It's just the rigors of managing the farm, and then if imagining you managing a farm and running Theory Underground and whatever, it just made me tired thinking about it. So
Everything I do makes people tired. I promise you that. Like there are people who get activated and inspired. But also as soon as people start to process like all of the things that I have to do or juggle, they do go a little crazy. And often like they'll start coming at me with like the motherly advice and, are you getting sleep? And, you know, uh, hey, have you tried this? And what if you did that? Because I mean, I'm doing like 20 full-time jobs right now, and I'm juggling them all. And what that means is that I'm constantly failing on like 15 of them while I'm barely getting by on the other ones. But that's because I productively procrastinate in some way that I think can be harnessed. And I think that, there is an actual um, future that needs to be pioneered by ADHD people who refuse to medicate. But I think that ADHD people who refuse to medicate can experiment with new learning styles, new teaching styles, new ways of getting things done, new ways of being generalist specialists. And like there's a real future uh, that needs to be pioneered when it comes to that stuff. And I feel like there's a way of writing my story. It's very oversimplistic and it's a fictional account, but it just says like Dave was going to be put on Ritalin, so his parents took him to North Idaho and raised him out in the woods and kept him safe from all that so that he could like maintain his little flame of inspiration that's never gone away, right? And the fact is I'm surrounded by people who are like these lackluster sort of castrated boys who live with their girlfriends for 10 years and they talk about maybe getting a cat someday and they're just roommates and they play video games, and it's like and they're on Ritalin or whatever the people are on now, and it's just like, oh cool, you got your lifetime subscription to Big Pharma and you've also got your lifetime subscription to your talk therapist, and you can all sit around in the coffee shops and talk about how woke you are with your polyamory and how the representation in your video games, right? Like that would have been me, is what I'm saying. And I hated growing up out there. because I was bored a lot of the time. But also, you know what boredom does? It teaches you how to make things interesting, you know? But as far as the day to day and the chores, I love working with my hands while I listen to things. Now you're saying, can I take the earbuds out and actually focus on the day to day? I'm planning on doing a year-long sabbatical in 2026, where the goal is really just to play a musical instrument and focus on the farm, right? Like, will writing come out of it? I'm gonna try to say no as hard as possible, you know. And of course, that means I'll probably end up doing something, but for all practical purposes, I will not be teaching online or at the university, and I will be focusing on the operation. But with that said, Anne is the one who cares the most about harvest. That's my wife. She cares the most about harvest and the meals. And my mom, she cares the most about planting. So my mom's like always had this fatal flaw of she loves to plant and she loves to grow and she loves to start things, but she's not very good at finishing them. She's not very good at harvesting stuff. And so it's like, you know, my dad would complain like, we're eating chips and lettuce that was bought at the store, but we've got lettuce out in the hoop house that's like wilting, you know, like that kind of thing.
I've lived it. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. I hope this never gets back to my parents, but also mom, I think she'll probably think that's funny. But no, Anne is the person who is heartbroken when the lettuce wilts and she loses sleep over it and she really wants to prioritize using things and using them well. And so, I mean, my hope is that we can find a good working relationship between my mom and my wife. Like that, you know, that if one's really like all about the planting and the other one's really all about the harvesting, and I can support, and then I can be the grunt sort of labor force. And of course, I could work with interns. You know, we could bring on a couple interns and I could be out there working with them. Totally. The idea of doing it without earbuds, I don't know, like if I'm in a state of sabbatical, maybe, but also I think there's no greater joy than working with earbuds. Like it's genuinely awesome. And I mean, I want to write a book called Working with Earbuds, you know. It's like it's I mean, I'm about as passionate about about working with earbuds as I am about anything else. Like, I think it's just one of the coolest things ever that I got to listen to all of Discipline and Punish during 2 days of working at Amazon back in 2022. After being in the college to university system for all that time, thinking I need to read that book, and then trying, and then being like, this is dry as fuck. I can't follow through on this. Like, this is terrible, right? Like that whole. Sorry if I cussed on your podcast. I just realized. But the listening is never as good as the reading. If you can sit there and turn pages and take notes, that is a tremendous advantage that you have over people who can't do that. But also, it's not an either or. I do both. And the thing is like, you don't have to read all of Discipline and Punish. It's a very dry book with just a lot of like seemingly unrelated facts. It's like, it takes him a long time to lay out what he's trying to lay out. And then at the end of the day, all I really care about is that part in section 3 when he talks about the bells. Like, you know, there's like those parts that stick with you. And then the part that sticks with you, it gets stuck in your head like a song. What do you do when this song gets stuck in your head? You can't finish the words, you can't even finish the tune, but you can't stop thinking about it. So you go and you search out the song and you listen to it. And that's exactly how it works when you're listening. You probably know this as well. And you go and you track down the part that you were thinking of to remind yourself what's really going on there, to check your assumption about what's going, because you get some kind of an impression of what the author's talking about, but it's a cursory skimming impression. It's never, ever, ever as good as actually reading. And so I don't want to ever say that like, oh, we won't read in the future, we'll just be listening. No, but I think that you don't have to sit there all day and stare at a book. You can listen to it like you're skimming it, and you can let your mind wander and come back. It's okay. You don't have to get it all at once. There's not an exam. Like if you're just doing it because you're interested in it and then your mind is not interested in it for a little while, well, just do what's interesting, you know? And then if something from that book actually proves interesting, then you can always go look at what was interesting later. But like for me, that's really helped short circuit the giant stacks of books that I always feel like, oh, I gotta read those, you know? It works for everything except for Das Kapital to bring it back around, right? Because that stack, there's that shadow cast over me, right? I listening to those just doesn't work the same as some of these other books. Like these ones are great. These ones right here, I can listen to these all day. You know, so I've got History of the Concept of Time and Pierre Bourdieu's Classification Struggles, and these two books are just fantastic to listen to. But also, I want to have the physical copies because I'm always going to find something new listening to it, and then I'll want to go and actually like look at that. You know.
Mhm. Sure. I just noticed it. I picture it like an inverse chart sort of thing. Like there's a complexity where it gets incredibly hard to listen. You know, like you have to. I guess I tend to think about it because it's like when the audio is just coming at you, it's like a wave. Whereas in the book, you're like kind of in control of every word you read. And then when I made the jump from being a worker on a farm to a manager, it was like a whole nother level of thought I had to put into it. And that's when I
Mm.
really became conscious of like, oh, okay, so I can listen to like Unsettling of America, but anything more complicated than this, I can't do the work I'm doing and listen to it. And then annoying customers get really annoying because it's like I'm not listening to things and I have to deal with you. I've got to be sober. I don't think so, you know?
Yeah, I got to deal with you sober. No way.
Yeah.
You're talking to a guy who never drinks, so
I'm a like figure sober
just in case anybody was like,
without my intellectual pacifier, you know?
there you go. Okay.
That was useful, Laurie, because my instant impression was like, oh, he's drinking out there the whole
Yeah,
time.
yeah, that'd make it fun.
Yeah.
Um,
Like, the work's too hard to do while drinking. So I think I'm going to be a manager now and I can do that well. Yeah. No, but what you're saying is that they don't get through the sober filter. Like there are people who they're basically intolerable unless you are drinking. And then if you were to look a little deeper, they're surrounded by people in their lives. In fact, their only social network is people who are drinking, right? Like outside of work, it's like all their people are, oh yeah, I love you. Yeah, you love me because you're drinking, you know?
Sure. And we're all just living in this fantasy land together.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's why I quit.
we should head out pretty soon. But I just had like a factual question. I was just curious, like, how big is the farm that you're going to be going to working on?
It's 5 acres.
Okay. Okay.
Not very.
That's
The property is actually 10 acres, but the part of it that is a farm is 5. The rest of it's woods.
okay. Cool. You can do something with 5 acres. Yeah.
You can do a lot
Thank
apparently.
you.
My mom's got so many hoop houses there now. My dad, it's kind of like my mom's just like she just tells him what to do and he does it. And that's kind of what I'm looking to do too. Like that's part of why I think I can be a good laborer because I do enjoy just doing things. And it's like put it on the whiteboard, I'll go do it, you know. Uh I'm not a good manager. So, my heart goes out to you, but that's like the work. I mean, I would rather do everything myself than have to manage other people,
I would agree.
which
Yeah, that's hard.
which is bad if you're trying to grow into some kind of a big operation, obviously.
But it
Yep.
sounds like you have like a team there, at least gelling. So, um,
Really?
you guys are going to be on tour, right? And you're coming through Kansas City in March, right?
Yeah, yeah. You know, I should probably, I've obviously plugged my own book, but I would be remiss to not plug Mikey's book, which will be out by the time we're on tour. And Time Energy is actually in its title. It's called Capital versus Time Energy, a Zizekian critique of Nick Land.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's going to be like 800 pages. It's a massive tome because Mikey likes to share the block quotes for everything he does. He doesn't like to do these little sentences, and because he doesn't have university credentials, this is, I mean, he's got a 25-page bibliography on this book, and he needs to in a sort of way because he doesn't have the academic credentials. And so not all of his books are going to be like this, but it's like, if you really want to understand the fundamental fault line of the theory scene between 1992 and now, if you really want to understand the two main schools of thought that were doing interesting things at that time that had a huge influence on the kind of people who were on the internet before most of us got on it, then you actually, yeah, you'll want to learn about the CCRU and the Ljubljana School, right? And that's basically Nick Land and Slavoj Žižek, respectively. And most people don't have the patience for that, much less the time, energy, or motivation. And Mikey, he's just a beast, and he loves theory, and he's been doing it his whole life practically. And so he's amazing at being able to break down complexity and make it accessible without dumbing it down. And so this book is going to be a pretty, I mean, I was going to say game changer. It's like nothing's going to be the same. Like, for real, this is going to be a wild book. But yeah, we're really excited to tour it, and the actual book launch will happen there in Kansas City. So like right in your neck of the woods. We'd love to see you there.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. We will probably meet up for real then.
Yeah, we'd love to come out and check out anything, any part of your operation or something like that. That'd be really cool. We're gonna have a crew with us. We're gonna have Nance and Anne and Will, and Will's coming from the UK to make a documentary about all this stuff. And we're doing these experimental events. It's gonna be pretty neat. But like the big point of the experimental events is really like exercises and learning to speak to the interstices between the niches in like the most hybrid way possible. Like, we'll be live streaming, we'll have people in a Zoom call, and we'll be like right there. People will be walking by, and you'll have people who are there for the event, who came out for the event, who might have flown in for the event, but you'll also have actual passersby. And that's kind of how it already is on a live stream, right? You have like this rotating door of an audience, a lot of turnover, the average live stream viewer on our streams is 20 minutes. They're only there for 20 minutes. On a lot of other streams, they're only there for 3 minutes or 30 seconds. So it's like, yeah, what I'm excited about is the opportunity to kind of say, how that's going on online? That's also going on if you do events in public. That's actually how that works. And so to mix those two things while developing a way of communicating that is not, I guess, just supposing that we're talking to the niches.
Well, Dave, thank you for coming on and telling us all about you, your life, and where you're hoping to go.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, totally.